My wife's best friend called me and said she'd gone to a gala dinner with another man. I didn't react. I didn't yell. I didn't ask why. I just thanked her and hung up. When I parked the car in front of the luxurious hotel where the event was taking place, I didn't expect to find them laughing. She, wearing the same dress we'd worn to renew our wedding vows. He, wearing my favorite perfume, the one she said only suited me. The two of them dancing, gazing at each other like teenagers in love. When she saw me, she froze. She had no words, no apologies. She simply froze in time, perhaps expecting me to cause a scene. But all I did was look. A dry, direct, final look. A look that said, I've seen everything I needed to. And then I left. Silently. Without a word. I returned home with my stomach churning, my chest sinking into an abyss, and I called my lawyer. On the day of the divorce, I was calm. Calmer than I should have been. And even though she tried to hold back her tears, I didn't look away. She tried to touch me in the courthouse hallway, telling me she still loved me, that it had been a mistake, an impulse, a need, but all I could do was sign the papers and hold our son's hand, who looked at her, not understanding why we didn't all go home together. I got custody of him. And it was there, in that moment, that my life began again. For months, she tried to call me. She texted me saying she missed our routine, our lazy Sundays, our coffee on the porch. But time passed, and on the other side, silence. Because, as much as I still felt pain, and I did, the pain never again overpowered my dignity. And I learned this the night I heard my son ask, "Daddy, why did Mommy go to dinner with another man?" And I didn't know what to say. There were no words. There was only shame. Not for myself, but for having trusted too much. She moved on with her life. At least she tried. She moved in with her lover. And for a while, I thought she'd found what she was looking for. She posted photos of herself smiling, toasting, with shallow captions like, "Life is now," and, "Not every new beginning needs approval." And yet, something about her gaze in the photos seemed empty. I knew that look. I knew every nuance of her face. I knew when her smile was genuine. And that was just a pose. A glittery mask. Time passed. I rebuilt my life in silence. I met new people. I made new friends. I rediscovered the pleasure of small things, like playing the guitar on a Friday afternoon or walking leisurely with my son in the park. I never looked for another love. Not in a hurry. But one day, he appeared. Unexpectedly, delicately, sincerely. Someone who looked me in the eye without trying to decipher my silences, but rather respected them. Who listened to me without trying to heal my wounds, but who wasn't afraid to touch them. Someone who, unlike my ex, wasn't running away from anything, but walking beside me, by choice. Meanwhile, across town, something changed. The lover's glow no longer overshadowed reality. The promises that had seemed so intense at first were now absent. The "I love you" became silence. The nights, once filled with wine and forbidden touches, were now cold and filled with ignored notifications. Until one day, when she opened the apartment door, she found the bags of the man who destroyed our family packed. And a note, "You were just a distraction. I'm back with my ex." And there, in that exact moment, she understood everything. She understood every silence I had. Every absence. Every answer that never came. Because what she destroyed in one night couldn't be rebuilt even with 1,000 regrets. She tried to find me. She came to my house. She rang the doorbell. She waited in the rain. When the door opened, it was my son who looked at her. And in that small, 8-year-old gaze, was a reflection of everything she had lost. "Daddy's having visitors," he said. And behind him, the new woman in my life appeared, with a calm, firm, unafraid smile. She said nothing. She simply placed her hand on my son's shoulder and led him back inside. The door closed. And my ex stood there, trembling. Because in that moment, she saw with her own eyes what it meant to lose a family. Not by fate. Not by tragedy. But by choice. By the wrong choice. She started going to the same places we used to. She sent unanswered messages. He tried to reach out to mutual friends. You tried to justify yourself. But all that remained was the echo of what could have been. And, ironically, one afternoon, we bumped into each other. She was sitting alone on the same park bench where we used to play with our son. She saw me from afar, with my new partner by my side and my son laughing like he hadn't laughed in ages. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't have the courage to come over to me. But as she stood up, he dropped a letter on the bench. I didn't want to read it. But I did. It said she would trade everything to go back to that dinner date, just to choose to stay home, with me and our son. That now she understands the value of what she lost. That she traded the essential for the momentary. And that the worst punishment of all was knowing she would never have the chance to return. Now she walks the streets alone. With an engagement ring that was of no use. With a heart that will never again hear, "You've arrived, my love." And me? I just carry on. With the certainty that love is surrendering, but never losing. Because true love, above all, is respect. And whoever betrays that respect, one day, ends up discovering the most bitter taste there is, seeing what was once their happiness, even without you. But there's something she never knew, and maybe never even imagined, something I myself only discovered on the day of the divorce, something that could change everything, or destroy what was left forever. And that part, is yet to be told. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, on the contrary, all stories are fictional, created to show how much infidelity destroys lives, families and hearts. Our goal is to make you reflect, feel and never forget that whoever betrays, one day pays the price. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is shocking, profound and unforgettable. Good story. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon when Daniel returned home early from work to find the smell of freshly baked apple pie invading every corner of the house. The aroma, mixed with the distant sound of his son's laughter running through the living room, created a sense of fulfillment he couldn't describe, but he knew how to cherish. It wasn't something grand, it didn't involve expensive trips or cinematic statements, but it was this, the feeling of home, of belonging, of having built something real alongside someone he chose, day after day. Melissa emerged from the kitchen with her hair tied back haphazardly, her apron stained, and a smile that, to him, was still the same as the day they met. He hugged her from behind, whispering something silly in her ear, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel that gesture more strongly than usual. Melissa had been his first great passion, the kind of love that begins without grand plans, but grows with time, matures with stumbles, and strengthens with daily life. They met in college, he was studying engineering and she was studying advertising. Melissa was the type who could light up any room, not because she was outrageous, but because she had a light and magnetic presence. Daniel was more introspective, calculating, and methodical to a fault, the opposite of her lightness, and perhaps that's why they fell in love. Their first date was at a coffee shop near campus, and she laughed for almost an hour at how he tried to impress her with formulas no one understood. It was a simple love at first, uncomplicated, with long walks and plans made on napkins. Over time, challenges arose, as in any real relationship. Graduation, the job market, rent, bills, the routine. But they overcame them one by one, like a couple who knew they were on the same team. When Melissa discovered she was pregnant, the shock was immense, but the fear was short-lived. Daniel knelt in the middle of the room with tears in his eyes and said he finally had a reason greater than any professional ambition. Not only a child was born there, but a new phase. With Luca's arrival, everything changed. The sleepless nights, the unexpected cries, the diapers and bottles replaced movie nights and carefree weekends. But even with the difficulties, there was a kind of poetry in the chaos. Daniel started working more to ensure stability, and Melissa chose to pause her career to dedicate herself fully to motherhood. It wasn't an easy decision for her, who had always valued her independence, but watching her son sleep in her arms, she found meaning that no advertising campaign could offer. And even on the most tiring days, when dark circles under her eyes and disheveled hair screamed louder than her vanity, she looked at Daniel and saw the unwavering admiration in his eyes. Over time, life resumed a more predictable rhythm. Daniel was promoted at the construction company where he worked, and Melissa began taking on some freelance projects. The house where they lived was gradually decorated, each corner taking on their own personality, books stacked on makeshift shelves, frames with family photos, Luca's drawings stuck to the fridge with magnets from trips they never took. It was all very simple, but it had soul. It had truth. Weekends were dedicated to family. They went to the park together, had picnics in the backyard, cooked together, or at least tried to, since Melissa was more talented at ordering through apps than cooking pots. Daniel loved to tease her about this, and she would retort that her cooking was too bland to be taken seriously. They laughed. And laughed a lot. Because, despite all their responsibilities, they still knew how to laugh together. Among their friends, they were seen as the exemplary couple. The ones who endured the years, the child, the bills, and still looked at each other with affection. Sure, there were days when fatigue overwhelmed them, when silence seemed greater than conversation, when sex became just another chore among many. But neither of them saw it as the end of their romance, but rather as a phase. They always believed that love wasn't made solely of grand gestures, but of persistence, even when everything around them seemed to push it away. Daniel, despite his busy schedule, made a point of bringing flowers on their anniversary and writing notes on yellow paper scattered around the house. Melissa, in turn, always made sure his shirts were ironed, his favorite dinner ready on difficult days, and a silent hug on nights when he arrived with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Luca was growing up fast, and with him came new discoveries. His first school presentation, his first fall from a bike, his first difficult questions. They took turns answering, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, but always united. Melissa returned to work more intensely when Luca started high school. She took a position at a local agency, with the freedom to coordinate campaigns and lead meetings. It rekindled a dormant energy in her. She felt alive, active, challenged. Daniel supported her every step, even when she had to stay up all night adjusting presentations. He never felt threatened by his wife's professional growth, on the contrary, he was proud. But little by little, imperceptible gaps began to appear, dinners cancelled, conversations interrupted by text messages, glances that missed each other at breakfast. Nothing serious. Nothing that sounded like a warning. But they were signs. Signs that, perhaps out of trust, perhaps out of blind love, he chose not to see. Melissa, for her part, found herself at a silent crossroads. She loved her son, loved her home, respected her husband. But there was a subtle hole, a slowly growing absence of herself. She missed the euphoria of beginnings, the adrenaline of first times, the feeling of being urgently desired. Daniel was constant, predictable, reliable. And this, while an unquestionable quality, sometimes made her feel invisible. She tried to compensate by immersing herself in work, in endless meetings, in new projects. She told herself it was just a phase. That soon everything would fall into place again. But silently, her heart began searching for something she couldn't name. Still, at home, life went on. Christmas was celebrated with the same tree decorated by Luca, their wedding anniversary was celebrated with wine and laughter over old videos, and the holidays were spent in a rented cabin where time seemed to slow down. They still kissed, still slept hand in hand, still shared the silences of the night with a rare complicity. But there was a part of Melissa that could no longer find itself in these moments. As if a part of her had become trapped in some old version of herself, somewhere along the way, and was now crying out for rescue. She didn't talk about it to anyone. Not for fear of judgment, but because she couldn't understand her own anguish. She loved Daniel. But she wondered, sometimes silently, if love was enough. Daniel, even with all his responsibilities, never stopped being present. He paid attention to details, was careful, and made a point of cultivating their relationship like watering a rare plant. And even when he noticed the tiredness in his wife's eyes or the distraction in conversation, he didn't interpret it as distance, but rather as the natural weight of adulthood. He didn't suspect anything, didn't protect himself, didn't create barriers. Because you never imagined it would be necessary. Because I believed, above all, that their love was shielded by the choices made, the years lived, the stories built side by side. On the surface, they were the picture of the ideal family. On social media, their smiles were sincere. In conversations with friends, inside jokes revealed intimacy. And even in the midst of hardship, there was respect. Daniel was proud of the woman he had. Melissa admired the father he was. And Luca, at the center of it all, grew up surrounded by this bubble of apparent stability. But there was something hidden. An invisible thread being pulled beneath the fabric. A silence that grew, a disconnect that slowly spread. And neither of them, at that moment, was ready to admit what it meant. Because admitting it would mean facing a pain that still had no name, an abyss that still seemed distant. There were still dinners, there was still laughter, there was still touching. But there were also disguised absences, kisses that lasted seconds too short, and glances that looked away too quickly. And while all this was happening, without fanfare, without drama, without any announcement, a choice was about to be made. A choice that would change everything. That would transcend time and memory. That would destroy what seemed indestructible. And most cruelly, this choice hadn't even yet been perceived as the beginning of the end. But it was. Daniel began to notice subtle changes in the routine of the house, as if small movements were being orchestrated in the background of a song he couldn't fully hear. Melissa began arriving late with increasing frequency, always with plausible but rehearsed explanations. She said the agency's projects had increased, clients were demanding, deadlines were tight, and the market, more than ever, demanded full dedication. Daniel, immersed in his own world of work responsibilities and attentive to Luca's growth, didn't allow himself to doubt. He saw her tired, sometimes absent, but he attributed it to professional demands, not any character flaw. He continued to cook dinner on nights she was late, put their son to bed, and waited for her on the couch with movies paused, hoping to share at least one moment together before the day ended. Sometimes she would arrive, take a quick shower, and say she was exhausted. Other times, there wasn't even time to talk, he'd come straight into the room, claiming a headache or an urgent need to rest. He'd tuck her in, kiss her on the forehead, and turn off the lamp with an uncomfortable pang in his chest that he still insisted on calling worry, not distrust. Gradually, their conversations became more practical and less affectionate. The exchanges of affection were replaced by reminders about Luca's schoolwork, grocery lists, and inane questions like, "How was your day?" Daniel tried to bridge the gap with small gestures. He sent messages throughout the day, made simple surprises like leaving a chocolate bar with a note in her car, or made breakfast on the days he managed to wake up earlier. But, increasingly, he felt his displays of affection were met with indifference disguised as fatigue. There were no fights, arguments, or shouting. The coldness settled in like a silent fog, slowly taking over everything, without anyone noticing exactly when it began. Melissa, on the other hand, seemed restless. She began to pay more attention to her appearance with an intensity Daniel didn't understand. She changed her haircut, bought new clothes, started wearing different perfumes. When he complimented her, she smiled politely, but her gaze didn't return. She was always in a hurry, always in a rush, as if she were living at a different speed. And she was. Sundays, once sacred to the three of them, became more spaced out. Melissa would say she needed to get some work done at the agency or that she had mandatory events she had committed to. Daniel, always understanding, preferred not to argue. He cared for Luca alone and, even without saying anything, began to harbor small absences within himself, like someone stacking boxes they know one day they won't be able to carry anymore. He was never the intrusive type. He never went through her phone, never asked too many questions, never insisted on answers she didn't want to give. The trust between them had been built on solid foundations, and even though it was now shaky, he couldn't admit that perhaps something was falling apart. It was easier to justify, to relativize, to rationalize. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe. One day, while organizing Luca's books in his backpack, he found a gold card lying among the papers. It was an invitation to a charity gala dinner at a luxury hotel. The date was striking, it was that very evening. Daniel was surprised she hadn't mentioned it, but concluded it must have been a last-minute event. When she arrived late in the afternoon, she was in a hurry, her hair tied back in an elegant bun and holding a new dress inside a protective cover. She said she'd been invited to an important agency event, one involving strategic clients, and that, unfortunately, she couldn't refuse. He smiled, feigning calm, but his heart raced with an uneasy feeling he couldn't explain. He wanted to accompany her, but she said no guests were allowed. She gave him a quick kiss, said she'd be back late, and left. The night fell in an uncomfortable silence. Daniel put Luca to bed, washed the dishes, tidied the living room, tried to distract himself with a movie, but his mind kept returning to the same question: why was this bothering him so much? He grabbed his phone, opened the messaging app, and started typing something. He deleted it. He typed again. He deleted it. Until he received an unexpected call. It was Amanda, Melissa's best friend, someone close to the family, almost an aunt to Luca. Her voice was muffled, filled with hesitation. She apologized before even saying anything and said she wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing, but she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. Then, with a shaky voice, she blurted out, "She went to that dinner with another man." Daniel remained silent. The phone weighed down his hands like an anchor. Amanda continued, saying she didn't know the details, but that she'd seen Melissa with a man entering the hotel lobby, smiling, laughing, and then being led to the gala ballroom. She said she tried to convince herself it could be a client, a colleague, anything. But the way they looked at each other, the way they touched, left no doubt. It wasn't professional. It was intimate. Daniel thanked her. His voice was dry, emotionless. He hung up and stood there for minutes, trying to organize the chaos that was beginning to form inside him. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't punch the walls. He just grabbed his wallet and car keys and left. When he parked in front of the hotel, the tinted windows of the main hall allowed only glimpses of lights and silhouettes. He entered with firm steps, as if seeking proof, not an explanation. The receptionist tried to stop him, but he only said Melissa's name, and she, unaware of the context, pointed with a polite smile toward the stairs. He went upstairs. And there she was. In the center of the hall. Laughing. Glowing. Wearing the same dress he'd helped her choose months earlier, when she'd said she wanted something elegant but not flashy. Beside her, a tall man, his hair neatly combed, his suit jacket neat, his hand resting too casually on her waist. And then she saw him. And froze. The laughter faded. The glow faded. His eyes widened. Daniel didn't need to say anything. He didn't shout, he didn't go over to them, he didn't ask who the man was. He just looked. And he looked in a way that hurt. In her. In him. And in everything that once existed. He turned and left. As he descended the stairs, each step felt like a blow. A cut. A rupture. On the way out, he ignored the receptionist's gaze, the forced smiles of the security guards, and got into his car without turning on the radio. The city was alive outside, but inside, everything was dying. He drove through the streets as if unaware of his destination, until he stopped in front of his own house and saw the lights were off. He went inside. The silence was deafening. Her absence, now confirmed, was louder than any fight. He sat on the couch. He looked at the family photo on the dresser. He picked up his cell phone. He called his lawyer. In court, days later, he remained unshaken. The pain had already transformed into something else, a decision. When he signed the papers, he didn't seek explanations. He no longer needed to. She tried. She arrived with her eyes downcast, dressed discreetly, her makeup thick to hide what words couldn't. But he only watched her coldly. When she tried to speak, he stood, signed the last page, and left with Luca by the hand, without looking back. But there was still something. Something Daniel didn't know. Something she never told him. A detail that changed everything. A hidden truth, now approaching like a silent storm. And when that truth was revealed, nothing would ever be the same. Not for him. Not for her. Not for the man who, for one night, occupied the place that never belonged to him. 2 months had passed since the divorce. Daniel's routine was moving more smoothly, as if time were finally helping to heal wounds that had previously seemed irreparable. Luca was calmer, smiling more often, and Daniel was beginning to rediscover himself in small, everyday gestures, like making breakfast while listening to the songs he used to listen to when he was younger or reorganizing his books on a whim. He didn't talk about Melissa, didn't bring the past into the house, didn't dwell on memories. He just lived. Still scarred, but with the relief of someone who, despite having lost so much, maintained their integrity intact. On a cloudy Friday afternoon, he was in line at the supermarket with Luca when his phone vibrated with an unexpected notification. It was a message from Amanda, the friend who had told him about the dinner. She said she urgently needed to talk, that there was something he deserved to know, something that might change his perception of everything. Daniel remained silent, took a deep breath, and replied that he would stop by her house that evening. Amanda greeted him with a tense look, holding a thin folder in her hands. She asked him to sit down and offered him coffee, but he declined. The anxiety in his chest grew with every second of hesitation. She began by saying she had kept quiet out of fear, that she didn't know if it was her responsibility to carry that secret, but that she could no longer bear the knowledge of having omitted something so serious. Then she handed him the folder. Inside were printouts of emails, screenshots, photos. Daniel leafed through the papers with trembling hands until he found an image that made the ground beneath his feet disappear. It was Melissa, embracing the same man from dinner, in front of a residential building. But what really caught his attention was the caption of one of her lover's messages: "She thinks I broke up with my wife, but we're still here, just laughing at her." Another: "I got everything I wanted, now we just have to wait for her to implode on her own." Amanda explained that she had discovered it by chance, that a mutual friend was the man's neighbor and had told him everything without knowing about the connection to Melissa. The lover had never left his wife. Melissa, in fact, was used. Deceived. Manipulated. And it all began months before the dinner. Much earlier than Daniel imagined. As he left Amanda's house, Daniel felt a mixture of anger and pity. Anger at what they had done to him, but pity knowing that Melissa had thrown away her life for a man who never truly wanted her. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced the living room as if trying to put together the pieces of a damned puzzle. Every memory, every sudden absence, every meaningless excuse, everything was now part of a much larger, much crueler narrative. In the morning, he received a text from her. It was the first time she had attempted direct contact since the divorce. She said she needed to talk, that she didn't want reconciliation, but she needed to say something important. Against all his instincts, he accepted. They arranged to meet at a discreet coffee shop, far from anything that was part of their history. When she arrived, she was visibly dejected, her hair tied up messily, her eyes sunken, and the expression of someone who had cried a lot. Daniel remained silent as she sat across from him. She began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness or understanding. That she had made a serious mistake, yes, but it wasn't just about betrayal. That there was a weight behind everything she had been carrying alone. And then she took a deep breath and told him. Melissa had begun her relationship with the man months before the dinner. At first, she said, it was just an emotional distraction. A virtual flirtation. Exchanging glances in external meetings, long coffees, conversations about music and art. Things that, according to her, Daniel no longer had time or interest in sharing. She insisted she wasn't looking for sex or adrenaline, but attention. A look that would make her feel alive again. She said she fell into the emotional trap out of neediness, because she was confused, because she had lost sight of who she was amid motherhood, marriage, and work. But then, in a burst of painful honesty, she confessed that she had believed the man would leave his wife. He promised. He swore love. He planned trips. He asked for patience. And she believed him. She traded stability for an illusion. Daniel interrupted her with a cold voice, asking if she had even imagined what she was destroying. She cried, but continued. He said the worst punishment was already being carried out. The man had disappeared. You cut off all contact. He returned to his wife and pretended Melissa never existed. She had not only lost her husband and son, but was now viewed with contempt by colleagues, friends, and her own family. Her mother refused to welcome her home. Her colleagues at the agency whispered behind her back. And her lover? She discovered he was married with children and that the marriage had never been in trouble. It had all been a game. She was a toy. Daniel listened to everything with his jaw tense and his eyes lowered. For the first time, he felt something different. No more hatred. No more compassion. But a kind of absolute emptiness. As if everything that had once existed between them had evaporated. When she finished, silence filled the room for eternal seconds. Then he stood. He said he felt sorry for her. That he wished her no harm. But that there was no longer room in his life for someone who had destroyed so much with so little. And he concluded by saying that now he too had something to tell her, but that it wouldn't be that day. That, just as she had the right to keep secrets, so did he. And that, in due time, she would know. She tried to hold his hand, begged him to listen more, but he was already walking to the door. As she left, she breathed in the cool afternoon air with a strange relief. Not because she was free of anything, but because she finally understood the depth of the wound she carried. He had lost a woman. But she had lost an entire life. What Melissa didn't yet know, what neither of them imagined, was that Daniel had already moved on. That there was someone new. A calm presence. A woman who emerged slowly, taking up no space, asking nothing, just being there. Who spoke to Luca naturally, who respected his silence, who listened to his stories without rushing. Someone who didn't try to fix him, but instead walked alongside him through the process of rebuilding. And that same night, when he returned home, Daniel found them both in the garden, laughing about something silly. He watched for a moment before going inside. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally exactly where he was supposed to be. But there was still something to be revealed. Something that would make everything even clearer. Because before Melissa left home for the last time, something happened. Something she never knew. Something that would forever change the way she saw not only Daniel, but herself. The week after meeting Melissa, Daniel received a folded letter, discreetly left in his mailbox. There was no sender, just her name handwritten in a handwriting he recognized immediately. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, leaving it there, allowing time to fade the unspoken words. But something inside him demanded closure that hadn't yet arrived. He opened it. And between jumbled sentences, words slurred by despair, and repeated regrets, Melissa said she needed to see him again. Not to apologize, but to understand. She said she sensed there was something more. That he knew something. That he was hiding something she, until now, hadn't been able to grasp. And she was right. Daniel hesitated. He wondered if it was worth it. But he realized that, as much as he had overcome the pain, there was still one last thing to do. One last piece to put in the puzzle. He arranged to meet in a park further away from the city, where the silence of the trees could drown out the noise of the past. Melissa arrived wearing the same coat she'd worn the winter Luca was born. She was thinner, her face makeup free, and her eyes marked by nights he knew were sleepless. She didn't say anything for the first few minutes. She just sat beside him on the bench and waited. Daniel took a deep breath, and then calmly began to tell the story. He said that 3 weeks before the gala dinner, he found an envelope in one of Melissa's dresser drawers. It wasn't addressed to him, but it was there, forgotten among old documents. Upon opening it, he saw bank statements in her name with strange transactions. Large deposits on spaced dates, amounts that didn't make sense given the salary she claimed to be earning. He tried not to rush. He considered confronting her, but decided to investigate cautiously. It was then that he discovered, through an acquaintance who worked at a finance company, that the funds weren't coming from the agency where Melissa claimed to work, but from an account linked to an events company, the same one that had hired the man at the dinner as its public relations manager. This set off alarm bells. But he didn't yet know what it meant. He only knew there were lies. And where there are lies, there's more than meets the eye. As she listened, her face drained of color. Daniel continued. He said he decided to go there, and there he discovered more. The name of the man she was involved with was listed not only as an employee, but also as a silent partner in a group of businessmen who used charity events to mask a money laundering and emotional grooming scheme targeting women in creative positions. Melissa wasn't the only one. There were others. All married, well-positioned women, mothers, vulnerable. He approached them subtly, gained their trust, initiated an intense emotional relationship, extracted personal details, career plans, projects, and then disappeared, leaving them devastated, destroyed, and, in some cases, with their professional lives tarnished. Melissa listened to it all as if hearing her own sentence being read aloud. Daniel said he decided not to tell her anything before because he was still trying to understand the reason behind it all. He couldn't understand how she, someone so intelligent, so focused, had fallen into such an obvious trap. And it was in this attempt to understand that he discovered something that would completely change the way he saw everything. One day, accidentally, Luca knocked over a box of Melissa's old papers. Among the folders and drawings of the boy, there was a notebook with torn pages and nervous scribbles. In one of them, there was a text that didn't seem meant to be read. It was a confession. Melissa wrote about an internal crisis, an existential void that began after motherhood, about how she felt disconnected from herself and at the same time unable to express it without seeming ungrateful. She said Daniel was too perfect, that his constant presence made her feel small, as if she could never make a mistake, never complain, never simply break. And that it was in this emotional silence that this man appeared, offering the freedom she felt she had lost, even if in an illusory way. She knew she was wrong, but said she just wanted to breathe. When Daniel finished, Melissa cried softly. Not like before, with despair. But with a more mature, more resigned pain. She said she never knew he knew everything, that she never imagined how much he had discovered and hidden. She asked why he hadn't confronted her. And he replied that, deep down, he didn't want to save her. He wanted her to realize for herself the value of what she destroyed. He wanted her, one day, to look back and understand, not through guilt, but through pain, that certain choices, once made, can never be undone. She fell silent. She lowered her head. And after a few seconds, she said she'd had a dream the night before. She was walking home with grocery bags, and when she opened the door, everything was empty. The sofa wasn't there, nor the paintings, nor Luca's toys. Nor the smell of coffee. He said that, in that dream, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. And he understood, in that moment, that the worst punishment wasn't losing his family. It was losing himself. Daniel then told him about the new woman in his life. He said she wasn't a replacement, that no one would ever take Melissa's place in the past, but that this new person had restored his peace. That she was sensitive, yet firm. That she looked at Luca with affection and never forced a connection, just let it happen. And that, unlike Melissa, she wasn't trying to fill a void, but to build something new, with him, not despite him. Melissa smiled sadly. She said she couldn't demand anything. She just wanted to know if Luca still asked about her. And there, at that point, Daniel hesitated. He said yes, sometimes. That on the quietest nights, the boy would ask why his mother no longer came to pick him up from school. And he always answered the same way, that his mother needed time to find herself. She said she was grateful for that. For not turning him into a weapon. For not telling him everything, for protecting him from the truth. And there, in that final exchange, there was no more resentment. There were just two people who, at some point in their lives, had loved each other deeply, but who now went their separate ways, with scars that no longer hurt but would never be erased. As they said goodbye, she asked if he would ever be able to forgive her. He replied that he already had. But forgiveness wasn't an invitation to start over. It was simply a release of burden. And now, he needed to move on without her. Melissa sat there on the bench, watching Daniel walk away with firm steps. And perhaps there, in that moment, she finally understood what it meant to love someone. It meant wanting the best for that person, even if that best for her no longer included herself. And as he walked, a gentle breeze touched his face. And with it came a certainty. The certainty that he had won. Not because he had overcome betrayal. But because he had chosen to move forward without losing himself along the way. He hadn't let the pain transform him into something he wasn't. He remained whole. And that, more than anything, was his greatest victory. The farewell on the park bench marked not just the end of a meeting, but the definitive closing of an era in Daniel's life. The drive home that afternoon was silent, not because of the absence of sounds around him, but because his mind was immersed in a kind of deep introspection, as if revisiting for the last time the rubble of what had been his marriage. It was curious to see how the human heart learns to rebuild itself even after being shattered. Not as before, not the same, but with a new structure, stronger, firmer. And yet, there was a weight, a faint residue of pain that he knew would not disappear completely, but would simply coexist with him, like a discreet scar hidden beneath clothing. As he crossed the threshold of his house, he found Luca putting together a puzzle on the living room rug, and that image, so simple and everyday, revived a tenderness he had long believed forgotten. He sat down beside his son, without saying a word, and together they completed the border of the drawing as if it were the purest metaphor for the moment they were living in, rebuilding, piece by piece, what was left of their lives. In the days that followed, Melissa's figure slowly faded from the corners of the house. Not physically, as she had been gone for a long time, but emotionally. The old photos were removed from their frames and stored in a box he didn't know if he would ever open again. Forgotten clothes were donated, objects that brought back painful memories were replaced with new ones, chosen calmly, respecting space and time. The woman who was now part of his life also understood this rhythm. She never pressured, never demanded prominence. She knew she was entering a delicate situation, and so she walked with careful steps, letting the bond with Luca and Daniel form naturally, without haste, without impositions. And this, for Daniel, was a silent proof of love. Not the explosive, romantic, and impulsive love he once felt for Melissa, but a more mature, more complete love. A love that didn't need a stage, only truth. Meanwhile, Melissa tried to move on. The scandal involving her lover had grown larger than she anticipated. It was discovered that he was part of a scheme of seduction and emotional manipulation to benefit shady contracts and illicit fundraising disguised as philanthropy. Other women came forward, and the accusations spread like wildfire. Melissa's reputation, even without direct involvement in the crime, was irreversibly damaged. She was suspended from the agency for an indefinite period. Her closest friends distanced themselves, perhaps out of fear of the scandal, perhaps because they didn't know how to offer support without appearing complicit in the mistake. Her own family kept their distance, claiming they needed time to process everything. She found herself alone, not only because of the loss of Daniel, but because she had completely lost her sense of self. She began attending therapy sessions, where she gradually began to understand the triggers that had led her to that abyss. The emptiness she felt wasn't Daniel's fault, as she had come to believe. It was an absence built up over years of ignoring her own needs, stifling them under the role of perfect wife, exemplary mother, and dedicated professional. When the pressure became unbearable, she exploded in the wrong direction. During one of these sessions, Melissa confessed to her therapist that she had recurring nightmares. In them, she saw Daniel with another woman, smiling, living the same routine that had once been theirs. And the most painful part, according to her, wasn't jealousy. It was the contrast between the peace he seemed to have found and the chaos that still resided within her. These dreams, though painful, awakened a new understanding in her. For the first time, she began to truly wish for Daniel to be happy. Not out of obligation or guilt, but because she understood that he had always been on the right side of history. And, perhaps, because she finally realized that true love isn't destroyed by betrayal, it transforms. And sometimes, it transforms into distance, into silence, into memory. One afternoon, Melissa ran into Amanda at a bakery. The encounter was awkward but polite. They exchanged a few words. Amanda, with a hard but still human look, said she hoped she was seeking help. Melissa replied that she was. And, before leaving, he said he now understood what he had lost. Not just Daniel, but herself. Amanda didn't respond. He simply nodded and left. The conversation lasted minutes, but it was enough for Melissa to understand that forgiveness is something life sometimes doesn't offer. That some wounds can't be healed with words. That some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Daniel, for his part, was beginning to experience a new phase. He took Luca on a short trip, just the two of them. They visited a small town near the mountains, where they could disconnect from everything. On the trails, during simple lunches in family restaurants, during nighttime conversations before bed, Daniel realized how much the boy had grown emotionally. Luca no longer asked about his mother. But when she was mentioned, he showed no resentment, only a distant curiosity. It was as if he were understanding, in his own childish way, that some people simply don't last. And Daniel never spoke ill of her. He always chose neutral, careful words. He wanted his son to grow up knowing that love and pain can coexist, but that dignity is something that cannot be negotiated. The moral dilemma that loomed over Daniel now was a different one. It was about what to do with his part in this story. With the knowledge of what Melissa had experienced at the hands of that man. With the pain she carried in silence. He knew he could have exposed everything. He could have told her friends, her family, her colleagues. He could have made an example of her. But he chose silence. And this silence was, at once, a burden and a liberation. Because, deep down, he knew that the greatest justice had already been served, Melissa had been lost. And he had not. Melissa had given in to the illusion. And he remained steadfast. Melissa had become shadow. And he, light. And the knowledge of this was enough. Upon returning from his trip, Daniel invited his new partner to dinner at his house with Luca. He prepared her favorite recipe, put on soft music, and lit some candles. It wasn't a special occasion, but he wanted it to be. During dinner, he saw a calmness in her eyes he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. She laughed with Luca, asked sincere questions, and listened attentively. It was the kind of presence that required no effort. It was light. It was real. After Luca went to bed, she and Daniel sat on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she held his hand and said that every day she felt the privilege of being chosen by someone she chose to love again, even after being broken. And Daniel smiled. Because, for the first time, he felt his heart no longer ached. It just beat. In the right rhythm. In the right place. At the right side. But the story didn't end there. Because the next day, Melissa would leave one last letter. A letter that wasn't a request, nor a farewell. It was a final confession. And in that letter, there was something Daniel never expected to read. Something that, once again, would forever change the way he saw that woman. And maybe, just maybe, the end of this story wouldn't be about guilt or redemption. But about understanding that, behind every betrayal, there's a fragile humanity trying to find itself. And that, amidst the chaos, there's always a choice, whether it's the pain that destroys or the courage that rebuilds. The manila envelope had been left at the gate, unsigned, delivered by a motorcycle courier who offered no explanation. When Daniel picked it up, the handwriting in the upper left corner gave away its origin before he even had to open it, Melissa. For a few seconds, he considered throwing it away, avoiding yet another return to her words, but something about the envelope's thickness, the precise weight of the paper, suggested this was no ordinary attempt at rapprochement. That night, he waited for Luca to fall asleep and then sat at the kitchen table, with the yellowish light hanging over the wood and the silent city beyond. He opened it calmly. Inside, there weren't many pages, but what was written on them carried the density of a long pent-up outburst. It began without a greeting, straightforward, as if there was no time for beating around the bush. You need to know what happened that day, before dinner. Not because I want to change what happened, but because it would be cowardly of me to leave without telling you everything. The next words were filled with pauses, erasures, repetitions of feelings she was clearly struggling to organize. Melissa said that, on the afternoon of the gala dinner, after leaving the agency with the dress in her car, she stopped in the square where she used to play with Luca when he was still little. She sat on her usual bench, the same one where, years before, Daniel had proposed. She said she couldn't understand why she felt such deep anguish even in the face of something that should have been exciting. It was the first time she would appear in public alongside the man she had fallen in love with, or believed she had fallen in love with. He was waiting for her in an elegant hotel, with promises of a new, different, free future. But on that bench, surrounded by the silence of her own choices, Melissa began to cry. And there, between tears and memories, she pulled from her pocket an old note Daniel had written to her when Luca was born. Even when everything is difficult, I will be here for you. You are not alone. She said she kept that note in her diary for years, hidden away, like a silent reliquary. And in that moment, looking at those words, she understood the gravity of what she was about to lose. She thought about calling him, canceling dinner, returning home, perhaps too late, but still with a shred of dignity. But she didn't have the courage. So she drove to the hotel, parked underground, and sat in the car for over 20 minutes, trying to control her tears. When she finally went upstairs, her lover was waiting for her with an automatic smile, a distant look in his eyes, as if she were just another item on his agenda. And yet, she forced a smile, entered the ballroom, and walked beside him, trying to appear happy, trying to convince herself she had made the right decision. It was in this emotional state that Daniel found her that night. And now she admitted it, it wasn't a surprise she felt upon seeing him. It was relief. Relief because, deep down, she wanted him to see her. She wanted him to find out. She wanted someone to stop her before she sank completely. She confessed this now because she felt that the end wasn't just the end of a marriage, but the end of who she had been for so long. And she concluded by saying she didn't want to go back, nor did she expect to be welcomed back. She just wanted him to know that not all betrayal stems from a lack of love. Sometimes, it stems from the fear of no longer knowing who one is. Daniel finished reading, his eyes fixed on the last sentence. He took a deep breath and silently walked to Luca's room. The boy slept peacefully, hugging his pillow, his hair messy over his forehead. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, gently running his hand through his hair, and remained there for long minutes. There was something comforting in knowing that, despite all the pain, he had managed to preserve what mattered most. His integrity. His love for his son. His ability not to return to the world the pain the world had given him. The next morning, he took Luca to school and went straight to the gallery where his new partner was exhibiting some artwork. It was a small space, but full of life. She greeted him with a sincere smile, and for the first time, he held her hand in front of others naturally, without the weight of the past weighing him down. They sat together on one of the central benches, observing the paintings. One in particular caught Daniel's attention, a woman sitting with her back to him, looking out to sea, with a small suitcase beside her. A discreet caption read, "Every departure is, above all, a reunion with what's left of yourself." That night, Daniel didn't mention the letter. He knew it was part of an internal process, one that didn't need to be shared, not now. But he felt a strange, almost new peace. It wasn't forgiveness, nor acceptance. It was just understanding. Melissa, despite all her mistakes, had been honest about her pain. And even if that didn't change anything, at least it ended the cycle more honestly. A cycle that, for him, had no return. He didn't hate her. And, in a way, that was what condemned her most. Because loving someone who destroyed us is, in a way, offering them a way back. But not hating, just moving on, that is liberation. And Melissa, at that point in the story, knew it. She didn't respond to Daniel's silence with new requests. There were no new letters, no calls. She simply disappeared from his life subtly, like a photograph tucked away in a box at the back of a closet. She moved to another, more remote neighborhood, starting over with what little she had left. She worked as a freelancer for a while, then landed a position at an NGO that rehabilitated women victims of psychological violence. There, little by little, she understood that what she had experienced with that man wasn't love. It was emotional abuse. A manipulation that took advantage of her fragility, her crisis, her emptiness. And in that deconstruction, day after day, she rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried by years of silence and masks. She began writing short pieces on an anonymous blog. Stories without names, but full of truth. She wasn't looking for applause or validation. She just wanted to release everything she'd been holding back for so long. Meanwhile, Daniel began planning a new phase with his partner. They decided to move to a smaller house, with more green space for Luca to play in and fewer mementos scattered on the walls. The move was smooth, almost symbolic. As if each packed box carried not just objects, but memories quietly organized. On moving day, Melissa stopped by the old house to retrieve some forgotten papers from a closet. They agreed to go at a time when he wasn't there. But, due to a misunderstanding, they arrived together. The encounter was brief. Their eyes met. She smiled slightly. He smiled back. There were no words. Just a mutual understanding. There was no more pain, no more expectations. Only the past. And the past, however painful, has its place, but it should never inhabit the present. In their new home, Luca had a bedroom decorated with dinosaurs and planets. Daniel placed a bookshelf with his favorite books in the living room, and his new partner painted a wall in warm tones, saying she wanted the home to have its own personality. Little by little, they built a place together where love didn't need to prove anything. Where silence wasn't uncomfortable, but comfort. Where trust was cultivated day after day, not as an obligation, but as a choice. And there, Daniel understood something fundamental: starting over isn't about erasing what happened, but giving life a new chance to be lived truthfully. The moral dilemma that emerged was now more subtle, more human. It was no longer about betrayal, pain, or guilt. But about compassion. About whether, in the end, it was possible to wish well for those who hurt us. If it was possible to look back without wishing the other person was suffering. And Daniel, over time, discovered that it was. Because when someone destroys us and we still manage to build something more beautiful afterward, the other person's true punishment isn't what they suffered. It's what they missed out on. And that's what life always exacts. In the months that followed, Melissa and Daniel didn't speak again. But one autumn afternoon, as the sun gilded the dry leaves on the ground, she ran into Luca by chance in a bookstore. He was with Daniel's new partner, choosing a gift for his father. The woman smiled and greeted him respectfully. Luca hesitated, then ran up to Melissa and hugged her. She crouched down, looked him in the eyes, and asked if he was happy. He responded with the naturalness of children who say only what they feel, yes. Very much. Melissa smiled, kissed him on the forehead, and told him she was proud of him. Standing up, she looked at the woman who now cared for the boy. And said, without bitterness, "Thank you for loving him as if he were your own." The woman replied, "He is loved because he deserves it. Like all of us." And in that moment, without needing applause or an audience, Melissa turned and left. For the first time in a long time, with her head held high. Because despite everything, she had understood. It wasn't about being forgiven anymore. It was about forgiving herself. And moving on. Even alone. Even late. But moving on. Because life, even after destruction, still allows for new beginnings. And every step, no matter how small, is proof that pain isn't the end. It's just part of the journey. Time, with its silent patience, gradually rearranged each piece in its rightful place. The new house was no longer a promise of a new beginning, but a consolidated home. The paintings hanging on the walls carried recent stories, constructed with ease, without visible scars. Luca's laughter filled the rooms with a frequency that seemed impossible months ago. He grew with the maturity of someone who has witnessed love crumble and be reborn, and this made him a sensitive boy, attentive to the feelings of others, respectful of pain, and enchanted by the simple beauty of small things. His relationship with Daniel's new partner was neither forced nor imposed. It was born from the rhythm of care, constant presence, and emotional honesty. She never tried to replace anyone, simply filled the space with tenderness. It was the kind of love one chooses to build each day, even when the foundations of the past still echo in discreet noises. Daniel, for his part, had reached a peace that didn't seek approval. He no longer needed others to understand his story, nor to take sides. Life had shown him that justice isn't found in courtrooms or heated arguments, but in what the soul feels when it looks in the mirror. He knew who he was. He knew what he'd done. And that was enough. His love for Luca remained his guiding light, but now he also allowed his life to be lived to the fullest. He had rediscovered the ability to dream. He spoke of travel, of projects, of growing old with someone by his side. And the most beautiful thing was that he did it unhurriedly. Because he had learned, through the pace of pain, that good things also need time to blossom. Melissa, on the other hand, had taken a different path. After her last encounter with her son at the bookstore, she realized that the place that had once been hers no longer belonged to her. And not through anyone's fault, but through her own choices. She left for good, not out of resignation, but out of conscience. She knew her presence could confuse Luca, and she wouldn't allow that. She began writing more frequently, and little by little, her texts began to gain readers. She created a discreet profile where she published chronicles about new beginnings, human relationships, and invisible pain. Writing became her refuge, her way of reframing chaos. In one of these publications, she wrote a phrase that would become her most shared: "Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to remember who you were before you forgot yourself." It was in this process of self-discovery that Melissa reconnected. Not with who she once was, but with who she could be now. Without trying to go back in time, without harboring guilt as an eternal companion. She learned to live with the consequences, with the silences, with the closed doors. And she understood that some wounds don't heal to disappear, but to remind us never to walk barefoot on dangerous terrain again. Years later, on a Sunday afternoon, Daniel and his partner organized a small celebration for Luca, who was turning 9. They invited a few friends, baked a cake, blew up balloons, and scattered toys around the garden. It was a simple scene, but loaded with meaning. There were people there who were part of a new chapter, people who didn't know the past in detail but who respected the present with affection. Amidst laughter, Luca ran to his father with a letter in his hands. She said the teacher had asked them to write about the strongest person they knew. And he had chosen Daniel. Dad, hearing this, was moved. He opened the letter with trembling hands and read it quietly. Luca wrote that his father was strong not because he was angry, but because he never gave up smiling, even when everything seemed difficult. He said he wanted to be like him, someone who protects without hurting, who loves without expecting anything in return. Daniel held his son in his arms, his eyes filled with tears, and there, in that embrace, he understood that it had all been worth it. The last memory he had of Melissa came months later, when a mutual friend mentioned that she had been invited to give a lecture on emotional reconstruction at a university. The news made him smile. Not out of pride or longing, but because he realized that, despite all her mistakes, she too had found a way to move on. Life hadn't turned around to bring them back together, and that was right. Not all forgiveness needs to be celebrated with reunions. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply about not wishing harm. And that, for Daniel, was enough. The end of this story wasn't a fairy tale, nor a movie-worthy revenge. It was human. Real. Made of difficult choices, of consequences that shaped destinies, of silences that spoke louder than screams. It was the end of an era, yes, but also the birth of something more mature, more conscious. Betrayal destroyed a marriage, but it didn't destroy Daniel's love for himself, nor Luca's ability to trust the adults around him. Betrayal tore apart a family, but it didn't destroy the possibility of building a new one. Betrayal brought Melissa to rock bottom, but it also offered her the chance to rebuild with dignity. And now, after following each part of this intense journey, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Which part touched you most? Leave a comment, we'd love to hear your opinion. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for our upcoming stories, which always offer a profound reflection on life and relationships. Remember, betrayal isn't just a passing mistake. It hurts, destroys, and undermines everything built with love, trust, and time. It leaves scars that can't always be erased, but always teach us a lesson. Cheating isn't just breaking a bond, it's breaking one's own integrity. Here on this channel, we emphasize, we do not support, under any circumstances, any type of betrayal. May this story touch you in some way. And may it serve as a clear reminder, more than a drama, true love demands respect. And once broken, it can't always be rebuilt. Think about it. Until next time.